examples of things in our legal system that correspond to that?
Oh, okay. I guess if you punish people less when they're less like willing to stop committing crime.
David, do you want to?
Yeah, I like when you can plead insanity. Like
Yeah.
If somebody's insane,
Exactly.
punishment doesn't stop it.
But if
Well, the idea
you
is,
put them in jail forever if they're going to continue. Like
well, no, if they were temporarily insane, that's
They're
what,
temporary.
right? They were temporarily insane,
Then we got supposed to do crime if you're
right?
after that.
If they were temporarily insane, that means that it would have been unlikely that the prospect of punishment would have deterred them from committing the crime, right? Yeah, David?
You could also do, or apply that to crimes that are just committed in like the heat of the moment, not at all premeditated.
Exactly.
in anger.
Yeah, so that's exactly the, you know, first degree versus second degree murder and so forth. Edward, yeah.
Could it apply to like minors? Because like, based
Yeah, sure. That's a good example. Ben?
Wouldn't
Yeah.
you also like in doing like you're kind of like in doing that you're like weighting the harm thing, right? Because you're like they didn't really mean to cause that much harm.
Yeah, so intentions become really important
Right.
here,
So,
right?
but also isn't like like if I just like if I let's say I mug someone on the street
Yeah.
and I only really that's not like that bad a crime, but I'm actually mugging
I
a
see.
Secret Service guy who has the nuclear codes to a thing. Like my
Yeah.
perceived harm wasn't really what I like.
I see.
Like, and so like the crime, my harm is more than I really wanted to cause.
Yeah, that's another reason that could account for those types of things. But I think in many cases, like the minors stuff, that's primarily driven by the fact that we don't think those people will be that deterred by stuff because they're reckless and so forth. Okay, so now I want to try to relate the theory of optimal punishment to intellectual property. So with fines, if we could have a fine, right, the optimal punishment would always be equal to H, right? Why is that? Because in that case, the marginal cost of punishment would be 0. Sorry. Okay, well we know just from Pagu's principle that the punishment would be equal to the harm caused if there was no cost of punishing, right? And intellectual property is similar, but it's sort of in reverse. So, Mike Gonzalez? Yeah. How is intellectual property sort of similar to this type of issue with crime? How is the trade-off that we face similar?
Because of the way it could be copied or used for society in different intellectual property aspects.
Well, so what I was trying to say here is that fines, because they're just a transfer from whoever commits the crime to the rest of society, we would always set equal to whatever the harm created by them is, right? Because that just internalizes the externality. However, we don't enforce against crimes that severely. Why? Because when we do enforce, that has a cost, right? And that meant that we had to worry about this elasticity rather than just setting the punishment equal to the harm, right? And how is that a similar issue in intellectual property? If intellectual property is the way we reward creating new products, how would that change the amount that we want to reward products compared to the case that if we could just give them money for creating a product?
I mean, it's because there's a certain elasticity of them creating this intellectual property and the profits that they can make off of it.
Well, so, yeah, you go ahead.
Okay, so in terms of criminal activities, when somebody creates harm, you fine them for the amount of harm created. But IP is similar, but in the opposite direction because IP creates social benefits.
Yep.
So in that sense, the amount of, the IP guy should be rewarded for the amount of social benefits he creates.
Yeah.
But then you can't just give him the money.
Yeah.
So a possible way would be give him like a market power, but
Yeah.
that also doesn't make sense because it creates a net weight loss.
Exactly. So that's the relationship. It's just like enforcement against crime is costly because it hurts the person who we enforce against without helping society, and it costs us building jails. So too, rewarding new products is costly because we have to create market power, which creates a dead weight loss, right? So no matter how much profits, no matter how high profits are, there's always going to be a positive externality because there's always some consumer surplus created that isn't captured. And while allowing price discrimination can get us closer to having monopolists capture the full benefit, it'll never get us all the way there. But rewarding people with market power is wasteful because it creates dead weight loss. And so IP theory, the optimal amount of intellectual property, is basically just the same as Becker's theory of crime, except in reverse, that we're doing it for the rewards that we give for positive externalities rather than the punishments we give for negative externalities. And so we should create greater IP protection to the extent that the supply of innovations is more elastic to monetary rewards, and the social benefits of innovation are large relative to the rewards, and the dead weight loss that we get from raising market power is small compared to the increase in profits, right? Those are exactly the three factors that we talked about on the previous slide, right? So this is the fundamental trade-off in intellectual property. If the fundamental trade-off that we studied in redistribution was equity versus efficiency, the fundamental trade-off here is incentives for innovation versus the ex post distortion that those incentives create. So the more intellectual property there is, the more dead weight loss there is, but also the more benefits people get from innovation. And the first bit of market power we give to a firm, right, as we just start to raise the price above cost, that's only going to create profits and almost no dead weight loss, right, because of the Harberger triangle. So if we start with prices at cost, and here's the demand curve, and we just start raising prices a little bit, this creates a bunch of profits but almost no dead weight loss, right? So we can create a lot of profits initially at very little dead weight loss cost. So it's almost always going to make sense to give at least some protection to try to encourage the innovation. But eventually, as we start getting to the monopoly's optimum, at this point, profits really don't rise at all as we increase price, but dead weight loss rises by a lot, right? So it's not going to make sense to give full monopoly protection either. So we're almost always going to do something in between the two of those, right? We're always going to have some degree of, we're going to want to have some degree of protection for monopoly, but not full protection. And the question is, where do we want to be between those two extremes? How strong patent protection do we want to provide? Andy, do you want to go through what some of the costs are of intellectual property?
Okay, so there's clearly dead weight loss from
Yeah.
I would say the loss of opportunity to consume
Yeah.
products and
Just think of things that people complain about IP in the real world.
and also I would say like the technology, like there's no really like incentive for the protected person to keep on innovating.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's probably one of the most common things that people complain about is that follow-on innovators. Like, if I'm going to build something that builds on top of your thing, if I know you already have a patent on it, I'm not going to make that much money off of it, or I'm going to have to pay you a bunch of licensing fees, and that discourages me from innovating. On the other hand, Ben, what are the benefits that intellectual property brings?
It incentivizes the initial innovation.
Yeah. Can you think of anything else that formal intellectual property protection? Any other benefit?
It allows
So one of the most important things is that it gives you an incentive to disclose the information about your product rather than keeping it as a trade secret. So when Coca-Cola didn't have good protection on the formula for Coke, it basically kept it as a trade secret to avoid it leaking out. And in countries where people don't have good intellectual property protection, they're very secretive. On the other hand, when there's patent protection, you can publish all the information and other people can build on top of that more easily. Okay, so let me just give you some evidence about each of these costs and benefits. So this comes from a study by Cockburn et al., 2011, and what they did is they looked at different countries that either had strong or weak protection of intellectual property, and they looked at how long it took for that country after a drug was initially invented to actually get that drug. Because it's very costly for a company to launch a drug in a new country. It requires adapting to all sorts of particularities of that country. And they found that they compared ones that had strong protections for intellectual property and long patent lives versus ones that had weak protections for intellectual property and weak lives. And this shows, this is a cumulative distribution. So this is like, what's the probability that after 10 years after the drug was created, you had the drug? And you see that by 10 years, it was much more likely that the ones with strong patent protection had the drug in the country than the ones with weak patent protection, because it gave a much bigger incentive to enter the market. On the other hand, Heidi Williams in 2010 looked at the Celera versus government-led effort to sequence the genome. And she found that when Celera had discovered some gene before the government effort did, compared to the reverse case, that it reduced by about 1/2 of one paper the number of papers written about that gene. It reduced by 16% the chance that people would find a medical application of that gene. And that they would and reduced by 3% the chance that it'd actually create a medicine, and by 2.5% chance that they would use it in a diagnostic test. So it significantly reduced the amount of innovation following on the things. If Celera, who was a private company and who had intellectual property protection, had discovered it rather than the government doing it and it being in the public domain. Okay, so let's now focus on this trade-off in a model. Let's imagine that each new innovation creates a market for a new product. And the products that are created have no marginal cost of production, like music or other intellectual goods. And in fact, like most medicines, it's pretty darn cheap to produce them once you've created it. And let's assume that all of the products have the same average demand function, Q of P. And I'm just going to normalize this so that Q of 0 is 1, and so that the monopoly optimal price is 1. And then consumer surplus, of course, is the integral from x equals P to infinity of Q of x. The firm earns profits, P times Q of P, because it has no marginal cost. And we're going to assume that innovations are costly to produce, so that you need to provide incentives or people won't create them. David, what are some of the costs associated with creating innovations?
Just like the R&D that's involved, and also the opportunity costs. So if you have 20 guys in the lab doing research, they're not necessarily producing anything.
Yeah, absolutely. So capital, time, and also the important point, which is that 99% of innovations, even if they have good prospects, don't turn out to work. So even if they're quite cheap to invest in each one of them, given that the probability is so low, you better get a big payoff if it does work out. Otherwise, you're not going to have an incentive to do it, right? So we can then talk about the supply of innovations being how many innovations will be created if the profit that is earned on each one is pi, right? And so what is total welfare then? The sum of consumer and producer surplus, Emily?